Hello and welcome to the Knowledge Center stage here at Itron Utility Week 2018. My name is Adam Malik and I'm joined now by Phil Nevels. Phil, welcome.
Thank you.
You've got one of the most excellent job titles. You're the Director of Utility of the Future. It sounds amazing, but it's very, very true for Exelon, isn't it? You really are looking to the future. You are looking at what's happening. And to frame my first question, there's a lot of talk around smart cities. And when we were preparing, you were talking about that concept as well. But it still feels like a very ephemeral thing.
Sure.
Each city has got its own use case, and it's winning on that. But there is no smart city as overall. Based on your experience and what you're seeing at Exelon and some of the work that you're doing in terms of research, where do you see the real sort of concrete wins to start the smart city concept?
Sure. So you're absolutely right that there's no unified definition of smart cities. In fact, we call them connected communities. That's what we call them at Exelon. And we sort of start with where the problems are. I think it gets lost. People focus on technology and they focus on solutions without thinking about the problems that they're trying to solve. And so we take the position of, well, what are the problems that need to be addressed within cities? They're getting more congested. Trends of urbanization are increasing around the world. And as that happens, it's how do we leverage technology to alleviate some of the pressures and challenges that these trends are creating. And we're looking at technology in more or less 5 categories. Mobility is a big one for us, and I think it's big from the standpoint that the electrification of vehicles is a huge opportunity.
So it's electromobility in terms of creating that nexus between. Yeah.
Absolutely. So from a mobility standpoint in electrification, we think about, well, what do the vehicles of the future do for the grid? And so, I'm very bullish on V2G. A lot of folks don't think V2G is a real thing, and it has a number of challenges in the short term, but I think in the medium and long term, it's something that could be of huge interest to us, and so we're pursuing a number of V2G pilots. But as we think about autonomous vehicles and what the role of autonomous vehicles will be in our system, these are all things that we're trying to test in the Commonwealth Edison territory in Chicago. So some of the pilots we have going on there around electrification sort of take advantage of the fact that EVs are new. A lot of folks don't know what those are and how they are. So how can we, one, educate the public on electrification? How can we demonstrate how electrification can improve economic development in our cities? And how can we demonstrate that there is value to electrification for the utility? And so we have, as an example, we have a pilot in Chicago that is a ride-sharing program. And you'll see this in a number of different cities as well. It leverages electric vehicles to provide ride-sharing services. And so it's a triple win in that it supports the local economy from an economic development standpoint. It supports the utility from the standpoint that we're proving that electrification is viable and that it's as good as internal combustion engine vehicles. And it's good from an education perspective and educating the public. So one category is mobility. Another category is around buildings and building energy management systems. And so we see a lot of potential there, not only in the internal optimization of buildings and ensuring that their energy resources are being deployed in a way that optimizes for that building, but how can you support the network of buildings in such that buildings are optimizing across the network. And just as there's
So when you mean optimizing across the network, let me just try and understand that.
Sure.
So you've got a building A, building B, and they are networked.
Right.
So
right.
One's at high load, the other one's at low load. Is that the sort of optimization?
So there's optimization such that buildings are sharing resources with one another, right, especially when you get into a world where there are more distributed energy resources, and so buildings are actually in a position that they're generating their own power. So in the case that there's excess power, can that be shared with other buildings and that type of thing? But also, how can you look at buildings as a resource for the grid, right? As a additional mechanism for storage on the grid, or for the discharge of power on the grid, where there's an opportunity to alleviate distribution constraints in a particular area, to potentially mitigate the need for building out new infrastructure due to increased population in a given area. And so we see a lot of opportunity there in the building space. And that's an area where we've begun to design some pilots and focus some energy as well. And there's a number of different opportunities, especially around resource management. And the way I define resource management in the smart city context is how do you create a sustainable ecosystem such that you've got these increasing populations, you've got more people coming into the cities, but how can you accommodate all this growth in a way that continues to be sustainable and doesn't create an additional burden on the environment, right? So as we look at that, you've heard some talk here at the conference around this convergence of water infrastructure and electricity infrastructure and gas infrastructure. And to the extent you can bring those three together and create efficiencies, reduce waste. We're doing some pilots in Chicago as well around water metering. And as part of that, we're detecting water leakages in pipes, right? So to the extent you can reduce waste, you can create an ecosystem that is more sustainable going forward. So those are a few of the different ways. And some of the other areas that we're looking at are around city services. How do cities communicate and interact with their citizenry, as well as connectivity, culture, and education, and how do you sort of support economic development within cities. But really it's around mobility and buildings is where we're doing a lot of our work right now.
And how do you see the utility placed to act out in that world? Because it seems to me to have a unique element, as in it has the physical infrastructure.
Right, yep.
And then you put over that the data layer and so on.
Right.
It seems to be quite a unique player, yet I always feel like the utility is always in the background of these conversations.
Sure. And that's an excellent point, and that's very central to our strategy going forward, is getting more to the foreground of that conversation. When you think about smart cities, one thing that is very unclear is, who's the customer, who owns what, who's in charge, who's leading the efforts. Is it the city? Is it the utility? Is it the private sector? Is it the Google? Is it Microsoft? Who is it? And that's not clear. I think ultimately it ends up being all those different entities. But one huge advantage that the utility has over all those entities, when we think about smart cities, it's really infrastructure that is supporting all of that. Whether it's the sensor infrastructure, whether it's the connectivity infrastructure, whether it's the physical infrastructure, the delivery of power to the homes, and so on and so forth. The advantage that the utility has is that our business is infrastructure. We're in the business of securing infrastructure, ensuring its operation, managing, monitoring that operation over time, ensuring the maintenance, et cetera. And we also have a construct through our social compact with our utility commissions in our various states. We have a mechanism for paying for that infrastructure as well. Its costs of infrastructure are socialized, and that's very unique to our sector. Outside of that, and another couple reasons I'd say why the utility should be a central entity in this discussion is the fact that as we think about a smart city, energy concepts circulate throughout every component of our smart city. When we think about street lights and sensors and connectivity and all these different things, we have to do all those things in a way that, again, mitigates impacts to the environment and is consuming energy in a sustainable way, right? We're also in the business of providing infrastructure for the purpose of delivering energy. And so we're also in a position to play a role in ensuring that energy remains a key component of that whole ecosystem. And then a final point, which is maybe out of the purview of this conference just a little bit, is around this idea of equity and affordability, right? And that's something that's not really discussed that much. But as we think about smart cities, it's very important that all those smart city services are available and accessible to everyone, right? To everyone in the city, not just to a certain neighborhood, to a certain component of the city. And how do you do that in a way that ensures that everyone can get the same quality of service and afford it, right? That's also something that the utility is in the business of doing. We're responsible for providing service to all citizens. In ComEd territory, we have 4 million customers. In the Exelon footprint, we have 10 million. We need to provide service, the same quality of service to every single customer. and do that in a way that's affordable, and the utility knows how to do that. So those are all reasons I think utilities should participate.
And when you look at all of this, where is this move coming from, where the utility is moving much more into the forefront? Is it because of an opportunity, or is it fear? Because if you look at all the analyst press, right? Everybody's
sure.
like saying, utilities losing revenue, it's not going to work.
Right.
What's the driving motivation behind that? Because I get a sense that at the end of the day, everybody's going to need the infrastructure. But in order to have a growth paradigm, you need other things on top of that, don't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so fear isn't the word I would use, but it's a mixture of the two. I think there's huge opportunity in the smart city sector, but also, I would be lying if I didn't acknowledge that our fundamental business model as a utility is challenged. And it has been challenged over the last couple decades, since the early 90s. And, some of the primary ways in which it's challenged, of course, maybe the most obvious, are that, load in our territories is flat to declining for the most part. Mostly due to energy efficiency, which is all a good thing. It's great. It's great for the environment, et cetera, et cetera. But also as we look at the proliferation of distributed energy resources, including rooftop solar, community solar, these types of things, all those things reduce the demand for power through our infrastructure, right? And the way we make money is we invest in infrastructure to deliver that power. So if there's less demand for it, there's less need to invest.
So it becomes that vicious circle.
Right, you talk about the death spiral and all that, right.
And so how do we safeguard or what is the business model that will safeguard that infrastructure? Because you're right, the old way of doing it was we're going to build this pipe, because we know over the next 10 years, this is the consumption's going to increase, and that's how we're going to do a payback of the huge capital investment.
Right.
Where do you see the next business models? How do we justify that going forward?
So that's an interesting question, and I think there are, if you look in the utility space, there's sort of two avenues you could go down, right? So one avenue, I think it's still the infrastructure avenue, but it's to what extent can you expand the rationale for infrastructure investment? What new infrastructure can we invest in, or what new investments do we need to make to accommodate some of the changes that I mentioned around DER proliferation, energy efficiency, all these different things? That's sort of one avenue you could go down. The other avenue is entirely new products and services, which is, I think when you talk about utilities and what are they doing, and I think folks tend to default at, there's all these just completely new energy management services or these types of business models that we could do. But I think that there's a huge opportunity in the traditional trajectory, which is this, infrastructure play, but it's non-traditional in the sense that you can expand the definition of what infrastructure means within that. If that's the case, and if we go down that avenue, the business model remains the same. We invest in infrastructure, we earn some rate of return on that. But this is where, regulators come in, right? We're obviously heavily regulated. And to what extent can you advance the regulatory narrative such that the utility has opportunities to invest in infrastructure that maybe doesn't fall squarely within the definition of delivering reliable energy to customers?
So I was talking to a regulator in Ireland actually. And then he was saying that actually we need like a two-tier thing. We need regulation that safeguards the core infrastructure for what it does, quality of service and so on. But over and above that, we need to lighten up, right? Because otherwise you don't get innovation.
That's absolutely right. No, that's 100%. I think, first and foremost, the grid is not going anywhere anytime soon. And it's always going to be important that, we as a utility are ensuring the safe, reliable, resilient delivery of power. And the regulator has a huge role in ensuring that we ensure that, right? And that's never going to change. And so some of the structures that are in place to ensure that maybe stifle innovation, some of those are necessary, but at the same time, as we talk about it, the regulator needs to be forward-thinking, utilities need to be more forward-thinking, and thinking about what are those other opportunities for utilities to deliver value to their customers. And many of those, I think, go through the smart city framework. If I were to ask, regulators for one thing, what's one way in which we could do that, I think, there's so much unknown with where we're going with all the smart city stuff. And you brought up the point that there's a lot of point solutions, but how do we bring it all together? To figure out what the synthesis of all those point solutions needs to look like is going to require a tremendous amount of experimentation. And how can the regulator create space for the utility to experiment in ways that maybe they weren't able to experiment before? And some of that is, how can we, cordon off money to do that, right? It's a money thing, it's a human resources thing, it's a physical grid thing, but how can we get the resources we need as a utility to experiment with some of those new business models and structures and partnerships that we talked about?
Let me ask you this, because I'm getting signals that we're coming to the end of our time. How imperative do you think is it to create that ecosystem to enable safe experimentation in order to move faster?
I think it's necessary because technology is moving so fast, and right now the pace of policy is not keeping up with that. Every second that we're not keeping up with the advances in technology is a second that we're letting our customers, as a utility, we're letting our customers down because they're not able to fully access some of the value that is inherent in some of these technology innovations, right? So to the extent we can speed up the regulatory environment to maybe it'll never fully match the speed of technology, but get a little closer.
Just get a little closer.
Right, we can get some of that value that's in that technology. We can get, our customers can get access to that. So
that's perfect. On that note, we'll leave it.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well for watching this Knowledge Center interview at Itron Utility Week 2018.